A Ryzen 5 3600 benchmark and full review has leaked on the internet. Let's talk about it and dive into those benchmarks. A Spain-based tech site, for which I won't even try to pronounce because I would probably murder the name, leaked the benchmarks for the Ryzen 5 3600 and did a full review. While we do need to temper our expectations and treat these benchmarks with a grain of salt, I do find these benchmarks quite interesting. I did a previous video on the Ryzen 5 3600, and I think it's going to be the new go-to chip for gaming. And while it can do content creation, to really speed up your workload, you're probably going to need, something with more cores. But for a mid-range gaming PC, the Ryzen 5 3600, I believe, will be that chip. In the article, they put the Ryzen 5 3600 up against the previous generation Ryzen 7 2700X and Intel's i9 9900K, and the results were quite interesting. The benchmarks in this article are on par with what I've come across about a few weeks ago. The test setup for the aforementioned Ryzen 3600, the motherboard, is a Gigabyte Aorus Gaming 7 Wi-Fi. Same board I have in one of my systems. It's a really good board. And it's also using 16 gigabytes of G-Skill FlareX DDR4 3200 MHz memory. Plus they added the Founders Edition of NVIDIA's 2080 Ti to reduce all or any chance of a bottleneck during their testing, which is understandable. While it did slightly lag behind, or was on par with, Intel's flagship, the 9900K, I find the benchmark results quite interesting, given that the 9900K is a $490 part versus the Ryzen 5, which is a $200 part. It did beat the older 8700K and 8600K, and also bested its older brethren, the 2700X and the 1700X. All this using an early BIOS, because while they're still working the kinks out of the X570 motherboards, let alone an X470 motherboard. So I do expect the performance to increase as the BIOSes mature. And remember, we're only looking at single thread performance, because it's very understandable, that the 2700X and the 1700X is going to beat the 3600, just by sheer mass of cores. So multi-thread performance, yeah, it's going to lag behind. The 3600 is showing real promise, if the benchmarks are to be believed, which I got a sneaking suspicion that this is going to be pretty close to where the 3600 is going to fall. And speaking of benchmarks, let's have a look at them. The CPU mark rating has the Ryzen 5 scoring a 20,134, just slightly lower than Intel's 9900K. In single thread scores, the 3600 is handily beating the 9900K and the 9700K. And as we look at this one, we can see the Ryzen 5 3600 matched up against a plethora of other CPUs. And as I've said before, the Ryzen 5 is the weakest link in the new Ryzen lineup for the 3000 series. So that makes these benchmarks all the more impressive. In 3D Mark Firestrike, the 3600 falls in between the i9900K and the Ryzen 7 2700X, which is still quite impressive for a $200 CPU. And in 3D Mark Time Spy, the 3600 holds its own, while still being in between the 9900K and the 2700X. All three of them seem to be within the margin of error of each other. Now for games. Assassin's Creed Odyssey. The 3600 was more or less, as the rest of the benchmarks have shown, falls in the middle, in between the Ryzen 7 2700X and the 9900K. Now in Total War Warhammer 2, the 3600 is on par with the 2700X and the i7 6700K. Now it does fall behind the 9900K, but we're talking about 7 frames. Now all this brings us to, AMD is laying a smackdown on Intel. And I believe a lot of it is Intel's fault. You see, they haven't had any competition in years. So with no competition, it always seems, that Intel can set its prices wherever it wants. To them, who cares about price to performance, because there's nobody to compete with them. Now, that's Intel's own fault. And even now, there's been another leak on the internet that Intel plans on slashing its prices by 15% because of the Ryzen 3000 series. Now, if they would have had lower prices on CPUs before, I don't think they'd been losing market share like they have been since Ryzen, the first generation, launched. Intel CPUs are just ridiculously expensive. And the new Ryzen 3000 series has Intel shaking in its boots. Even an internal memo inside of Intel does seem to show that Intel is giving credit where credit is due. It gives key points on their AMD competitive threats are from high-end products. Now I'll link all these benchmarks and articles in the description below. But with the launch of Ryzen 3000, which happens on July 7th, a little more than a week away, tell me what you think. Is AMD about to put another smackdown on Intel? Is Intel going to continue to lose market share? And how excited are you for the Ryzen 5 3600? Tell me in the comments below. And I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. Your support is much appreciated. Until next time, I'm out of here. You all have a good one.